what we know is that there may be, in the part of the knot that is tied up, there may be DNA in there that we can't get access to if the knot is never untied.
We also can't get access to where this knot comes from and the type of person who tied it without untangling the knot and differentiating it from all the other knots. Does that make sense?
It seems to be pretty strong. We've got to pull it tight.
In part 1, we got halfway through the 7th prescient point dealing with knots, sailing, and this case. We're resuming with point number 7 now, and then there are 3 more points, and these 3 are absolutely crucial to understanding the type of device, the stick and cord we're looking at with any real insight.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So let's resume right now with point number 7. Number 7 is, when confronted, who did John think knew something about sailing? And remember the quote we referenced, we must learn to sail in high winds. That's from Aristotle Onassis, someone who was frequently on boats himself. So what we must also be able to elevate our thinking when we're dealing with a 28-year-old unsolved case. That means we have to think harder, better, and more intelligently. We need to think more effectively. We have to concentrate for longer than 10 minutes if we're to make any real progress.
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
If you're not paying attention, if you're not sensitively and alertly looking at the evidence, you're not going to be able to tell which note is off and when it happens. And I say this very often, but it's of very little use if you can't tell if the note is off and where that off note is. So when it comes to the knot, can you tell where the note is off? Now, in part 1 of this analysis, we've spent a significant amount of time discussing knots and the potential relevance of sailing. Do you know why? Do you know why we're doing that? It's not to implicate John. It's not to implicate Burke. It's not to implicate Fleet White. It's not to implicate anyone in particular. It is to allow the evidence to guide us. And for that to happen, we have to understand the evidence. And to understand the evidence, we've got to open our minds. We've got to be curious. And here the evidence is fairly simple. We've got an unusual stick and cord device, basically the instrument that killed JonBenet. And we see it lying there and we ask ourselves, what are we dealing with? What is this thing? And so the knots are part of answering that question. It's not the full and final part. It's just part of that question. But we can't even begin to ask that question if we're going to refer to the stick and cord thing as a garrote. And if you're one of the people that's been doing that, please stop, or at least please put it in inverted commas or do it with a certain amount of caution. The word garrote is used 7 times by half a dozen different people talking about it in the Netflix series. You have John Ramsey using the word garrote, St. Augustine the detective, Wickman, Woodward, and Carol McKinley. 5 people all talking about the garrote. That must mean it's obviously a garrote. Well, the CBS documentary that came out 8 years ago that got into so much trouble that Burke sued them for $750 million. Now, that I think is actually mentioned towards the end of the Netflix series, I think the end of episode 3. Well, they also refer to the paintbrush stick and cord thingy as a garrote.
On the original garrote.
So to reiterate, you've got journalists, you've got ex-Boulder detective in terms of Wickman, you've got St. Augustine, another detective, you've got John Ramsey, you've also got ex-FBI investigator, all calling this device a garrote. I'm pretty sure John Douglas did as well. So you've got all of these experts calling something a garrote. And I'm putting up my hand and I'm saying, I'm not sure it is. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying I doubt whether it is. And am I the only one? And perhaps I'm the odd one out here. Perhaps I'm the dummy. But again, when one note is off, it can ruin the whole symphony. And has this symphony been sort of settled? Has it been solved? Has it been finalized? And perhaps the reason it hasn't been is because everyone is going down the same stuck level of thinking. And maybe we need to think better and more efficiently and with more lucidity. And the garrotte thing might be the key to that. In other words, not thinking of it as a garrotte. And we can only be sure about this whole line of thinking with a more specialized knowledge of knots. There's another area we also need to go into, but specialized knowledge of knots for sure. Do you agree with that? Now, in the next episode, we'll define and compare garrottes, but for now, please, let's just go through this critical thinking process in a step-by-step, sort of organized, systematic way. For right now, let's concentrate on just this one area. What knot are we dealing with? And is it a sailing knot? Well, what do you think so far? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. By the way, thanks so much to John Schiiler for this 5-star review. He calls Christmas Star a very interesting book. It was a review left just a couple of hours ago. The 94th review posted on Christmas Star. He writes, if you are familiar with the JonBenet Ramsey case, you may learn some things from this important book. If you're reading Christmas Star, please leave an honest review and I'll post the next 6 right here on YouTube, and any comments or questions you might have, we might look into briefly as well. Let's try to get to 100 reviews before the end of the year. So with your help, we might be able to do that. Also, remember there are 3 different JonBenet Ramsey playlists as well, and some are quite obscure but very worthwhile dipping your toes into, such as the controversial Carnes order. Did you know that in April 2003, Judge Julie Carnes found in favor of the intruder theory? Was the Carnes order mentioned anywhere in the Netflix series? I wonder why not. You can also watch the 51-episode JonBenet Ramsey Countdown playlist. I'll put a link in the description. And if you've missed any of the analysis on the Netflix docuseries, you can catch the 20-plus episode Netflix analysis playlist as well. I'll put a link to that in the description. If you're finding this analysis on the very important not narrative important and meaningful, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, curiously, in this segment, in the first half hour, halfway through episode 1 of the Netflix series, this part that deals with knots and garrottes, do you notice that John has 0 comment? Does John ever mention the word knot? Does John make any commentary whatsoever on it? Because a documentarian, that ought to know John's background, also ought to know to ask him specifically about this. What can you tell us about the knots? And yet Netflix doesn't. Of the 5 people I've mentioned who keep mentioning the word garrotte, and I mean, you're talking about a garrotte, isn't the knot giving you some indication of what we are dealing with here? So who would you say is likely to know more, even slightly more than everyone else, specifically about the knots? You might say, well, maybe one of these investigators has expertise in garrottes. Well, do they? Have they had any experience in any of the other cases? If so, why don't they mention it? And we're going to compare this quote-unquote garrotte to classical garrottes. Now, what's interesting is that prior to the release of the Netflix series, John Ramsey clearly minimized his own knowledge of sailing, preferring to discuss Fleet White as a more experienced sailor.
I had Fleet and I used to sail. Fleet was a really expert sailor, and I was not.
And it's not the first time John has employed this diversionary tactic. It's also interesting to note we discover something about John's temperament through sailing that we perhaps underestimated earlier. He's very competitive and very meticulous. You have to be a successful sailor. He's also very ambitious, the kind of races that he enters. He's a very high-rolling yachtsman, to put it mildly. And whether you love or loathe the Ramseys, whether you think they're guilty or not, I believe this case proved that quote from Aristotle Onassis, they did learn to sail in high winds, just in terms of the legalities of this case. They rose to meet the challenge in terms of this case and beat the competition, just as they did in the whole yachting environment. And I don't think it's unfair and unreasonable to think about the Ramsey case from the perspective of the Ramseys as a kind of race, a race against time, a race against public perception, a race against aspects of the law, but basically just a race. And how do you think they did in that race? Number 8, when confronted, who did John think knew something about knots?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd been with him a lot, and I have no doubt that the police used him. Probably said, well, John thinks you killed his daughter and you got to work with us here. Don't know that for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised. Fleet and I used to sail. Fleet was a really...
Now, when John says, you got to work with us here to Fleet White, basically you've got to work with us to kind of nail John. He says, I don't know that for a fact. I think it is very likely it is a fact, because once Fleet became critical of John going onto CNN, this was within days of the incident. This was still in December, late December 1996. And so as far as I understand it, once Fleet became critical of John, John, don't talk to the media, go back to Boulder and work with the police. Once that happened, as far as I understand it, John did implicate Fleet and his wife, and they became suspects. It wasn't that the police lied and said, John said you killed his daughter. The police didn't make that up. John did finger Fleet as a potential suspect, and you'll never guess how and why. Well, because Fleet was a sailor who knew about cords, lines, sailing. Interestingly, he doesn't mention knots here in this reference, and it's from The Death of Innocence. Listen to this, quote, according to profilers he had hired, Ramsey said McReynolds at Santa Claus fit the description of a possible kidnapper. He doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together, he added. Now that in that sense he fitted the description because McReynolds wasn't very wealthy, he didn't have a lot of money. But of course, Fleet White was incredibly wealthy, he was an oil man. So in that sense, he totally didn't fit the description. But he did fit the description theoretically about the cord. That's so important. So once you looked at the cord and you thought, okay, just in terms of the cord, who might have committed this crime? Oh, Fleet White. Right? And so John said, it's not mine, meaning it's not my cord. Fleet White knows about cords, lines, and sailing. When asked about the duct tape, he replied that it was something Fleet White would own as well. Fleet had some special tapes, possibly black duct tape. And then he also spoke about Priscilla, Fleet's White apparently owning a stun gun. Now, on the other hand, Patsy, who was an artist, also used duct tape to sort of line the back of her artworks, when you were framing them. So we can also talk about the duct tape that the Ramseys were perhaps in the habit of using as well. And we'll leave that for later analysis. But let's go on to number 9. John probably knew about knots, but would 9-year-old Burke know anything about them? So do you agree with that point that as a sailor, John probably did know something about knots? But why would that mean anyone else would know about them? And you might say, okay, maybe John knew something about knots. So what? What about anyone else? You might also say, I don't think John killed JonBenet. But if you did say that, I'd agree with you. I'd say, yeah, I don't think John killed JonBenet. So doesn't that mean his knowledge of knots is effectively irrelevant?
Honestly, it might.
So if John's knowledge is irrelevant, who else in the Ramsey home could possibly know anything about knots? And you might argue that sailors might know a thing or two about knots. Well, more than a thing or two, but that Burke wouldn't. He was simply too young to sail, and they don't teach sophisticated knots to Boy or Cub Scouts. Ergo, this comment over here. Someone wrote, this really isn't anything new. For us military puffs, I'm a retired military officer. It's well known that sailors, special forces, are all taught to tie specific kinds of knots, and those found on the paintbrush handles are both reef and cleat hitch knots. Neither are taught to Boy or Cub Scouts. And this raises an interesting question. Are the knots we're dealing with here sailing knots or scout knots, or a bit of both? Anyone know the answer to that question? And this is why you need to become somewhat or develop some kind of expertise on knots and on sailing knots and on scout knots to be able to answer that question. So we've got to find out a bit about sailing, find out a bit about scouts, find out a bit about knots as well. And so on the question whether Burke knew anything about sailing or knots, we actually get confirmation of a sort from a very peculiar source. The lawyer at John Ramsey's side on the day after Christmas, hours after JonBenet was found, well, it's from the family friend Mike Bynum, who said the following: I went sailing with them on Lake Charlevoix where, even though they were 6 and 9, that's a reference to JonBenet and Burke respectively, both kids had jobs on the boat. That must be emphasized. Both kids, JonBenet and Burke, had jobs on the boat. Both were treated with respect and showed respect back to their parents. Sailing was another family activity that was important to both John and Patsy. We don't really hear much about this important family activity generally when John is talking, because he keeps minimizing it. But maybe it is important. And don't jobs on the boat imply that they received some training in sailing from their father, Burke and JonBenet? Interestingly, when deposed in 2001 and John was asked if he received any training, he didn't volunteer, as far as I know, that he trained his own children or sent them for sailing lessons. Now, I think if you're sending your children for sailing lessons, that implies quite a high degree of seriousness about sailing. Incidentally, this is also confirmed by their mother, by Patsy, in the 1995 Christmas letter. Have a look. Summer on Charlevoix was spent taking golf and sailing lessons each day. Every day, sailing lessons. And Patsy also adds, Burke is quite the sailor. See, it's not just about sailing lessons, but what do basic sailing lessons involve? And so I Googled this. According to Discover Boating, included with beginner basics like sailing vocabulary is knot tying. Do we need like a loud deafening bang here? Or is it not a big deal? Number 10, which of the intruder suspects were sailors? How about this guy? Bill McReynolds died in 2002 and he appeared poorly long before then. Was he a sailor? How about the housekeeper? Was she a sailor? Did Linda Hoffman-Pugh ever crew a super yacht, perhaps something like the Bayesian? Well, let's take a look inside Perfect Murder, Perfect Town for some confirmation about her background. These are her words cited by Lawrence Schiiler. I was born in Lyons, Kansas, and my dad was a poor wheat farmer. I had 3 brothers and 1 sister. I'm the youngest, and one of my brothers is 23 years older than me. He's a welder with his own construction business in Fort Morgan, Colorado. When I was 13, we moved from the farm to Fort Morgan because my dad wasn't doing well. We went to work for my brother as a ditch digger. My dad was an alcoholic. He died in 1986. My mother was 41 when she had me. I have 6 living kids, 10 grandchildren, and a paper route. Is there anything in there about sort of training as a sailor, perhaps? I have my ladies, the woman I work for. I have a doctor's wife in Greeley and a lawyer. I was working for a bonded agency called Merry Maids when I met Patsy. I started with her 1 day a week. I was dumbfounded. The place was so huge. It was too much for one person. Soon we had 4 people once a week. And I assume that means we had 4 people working around the Ramsey home once a week. Is there anything there about moonlighting as a deckhand, perhaps a spell in Monaco?
No. Which brings us at last to the moment of truth.
Do you remember we started out with a bunch of contradictory questions? Are we able to answer them now? Why are there loose knots versus tight knots in the story? Why is there blunt force trauma as well as a red heart drawn on JonBenet's hand? Why are there marks on JonBenet's back and face, and were these marks made to stun or to revive her? Was JonBenet murdered or killed by accident? What exactly are we talking about when we're dealing with these knots? What is the true nature of the sexual crime? Is it the work of an adult pedophile monster, or is it less severe, or is there no attack whatsoever? In part 3 of this series, we'll examine the Scout narrative. I want to leave you with this image, which is a very unusual image from kind of a way back position, where you can see the grill. Below that grill that the apparently open basement window was located. This is the intruder theory in a nutshell. And just look at how obvious it is, just how easy it is for anyone in the house to see anyone going down into that grate, or for that matter, coming out of that grate. This image in a nutshell should tell you just how absurd the intruder theory actually is. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.